In the comments under our various videos that deal with Japan, you can't help but notice that there is a fair amount of confusion as to how the Japanese government actually works. So I thought today I'd talk about the structure of the Japanese government and clear it up a bit. Or maybe just make it even more confusing. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is a World War II in real-time special episode on the Imperial Japanese government. So, Hirohito is Emperor of Japan. What kind of powers does he have? You'd think that would be an easy question, but it actually isn't. The Meiji Constitution from 1889 gives the emperor sovereignty, and also gives him such executive, legislative, and judicial rights that it looks like he's an absolute monarch, and it calls him sacred and inviolable, and says he has supreme authority as head of the empire. There's all that, but there are articles in the Constitution that delegate the exercising of those rights, and in a big way, to the cabinet for executive, to the diet for legislative, and to military for military matters and administration. The net effect of this ambiguous blend of absolute and limited monarchy was that Emperor Hirohito reigned but did not rule. By now, in 1941, how this works in practice is that his government makes the policy decisions and agrees to what they want to implement at liaison conferences, and then Hirohito gives them legitimacy at imperial conferences. That's kind of it. He has advisors, like the keeper of the Privy Seal, who try to keep him neutral so he can be seen as above politics and as a symbol of national unity. But you know, all of those government institutions that the Constitution established do not work in unity, and they are the ones who exercise the emperor's rights. And in Japan, they often have bitter rivalries with one another, and Hirohito can end up ratifying conflicting policies. The cabinet, the executive, is not responsible to the legislative diet, but to the emperor, and it is he who appoints the prime minister. He is advised in this by the Privy Seal keeper and a conference of former prime ministers, among others. The cabinet has become ever more of an assertive force, and it deals with things like foreign policy and finance, and there's a home ministry for domestic issues. But though there are army and navy ministers, the cabinet is weak with respect to the military. It does not control them. And it also needs the cooperation of the Diet to actually legislate its policies. The Diet does not always comply. The lower house, the House of Representatives, which is elected, is dominated by two conservative parties. The upper house, the House of Peers, made up of nobles and appointed officials, and even more conservative, is a check on the lower house. But it isn't just the Diet that influences policy, either formally or informally. There are a bunch of military and civilian groups that do so as well. The Privy Council, the Supreme War Council, the Reservists Association, several business groups and labor organizations, the service ministers, the service chiefs, and so on. So, there are conflicts inherent in this from the ground up, but it was mostly pretty manageable until the 1930s. Things started to get shaky with the Great Depression and the whole Manchurian incident. And much as in other countries all over the world, in the 1930s, Japan had a rise in ultranationalism, which saw a lot of people within the armed forces wanting to bring a military dictatorship to power. There were planned and attempted coups, and we covered all of this stuff in detail in Between Two Wars Season 1 over on our Time Ghost channel, so I will not do it again here. None of these were successful though, and those radicals in the military began trying to manipulate power more subtly, with control over the non-party cabinets. These were bureaucratic in nature and came about following Prime Minister Tsuyoshi's assassination in 1931. And while the Constitution gives the emperor supreme military command, over which the cabinet has no control, the military, in particular the Army General Staff, used the Chief of Staff's direct access to the throne to usurp this power and gain political ascendancy. Like in 1937, just as the war in China was getting going, the Imperial General Headquarters was revived and took control of all combat operations. This included both Army and Navy ministers, but was dominated by the Army and Navy Chiefs of Staff. Also, a year earlier, in 1936, the Army and Navy cabinet ministers get the requirement to be generals and admirals on active service. So the military had the power to make any cabinet fall by just withdrawing a minister or refusing to give one in the first place. That is an increase of power right there, because that informal veto made the cabinet kind of subservient to the Army's and the Navy's will. This power was used several times when a cabinet could not get the Diet's support for specific military policy or issues. But you know what? Just the fact that the Army ever had to do this shows how much the two main parties in the House of Representatives wanted to maintain their influence, even though in general they supported a national defense state. See, they had formed the cabinets for much of the period before 1932, when the cabinets became non-party, and they did not want to lose power to military centralization. The war in China, the China incident, hastened and intensified that centralization process, and not just with reviving the Imperial General Headquarters. In March 1938, Prime Minister Konoye managed to get the Diet to support a national mobilization law. This gave him and his cabinet pretty big wartime authority over production, wages, prices, resources, and transportation. Thing is, the Army, well, and anyone who wanted more centralization of power, was still often frustrated by the need to negotiate with different parties in the Diet. So in October 1940, the Imperial Rule Assistance Association was formed with Konoye as president. Existing political parties were to voluntarily dissolve themselves and join the IRAA, much as labor organizations were pressured to join a new industrial patriotic league. You might think that this would greatly strengthen government control, but it did not work that way. See, everyone, the parties, the bureaucrats, and even the Army, was only prepared to support the IRAA as long as their own interests were not compromised. So, up until October 1941, the Japanese political system was a balance between competing elites, with the Army's preponderance more hegemonic than dictatorial because of its need to forge cooperative working relationships with other elites. Things have been really tricky when dealing with stuff like foreign policy. The Army and Navy act without cabinet control, so the cabinet and the Foreign Office cannot make policy and policy decisions and be sure that the military is going to comply with them. And on the other side of that coin, the general staffs and the field commanders often take actions that are not authorized by the government. And the Army and Navy are very competitive with each other for prestige and resources. The liaison conferences were established because of the China War to try to finally coordinate civilian and military branches of government. These have most often been made up of the Prime Minister, the Service Ministers, the Foreign Minister, the Army and Navy Chiefs, and the Vice Chiefs of Staff. Liaison conferences are not provided for in the Constitution, but they soon replace the cabinet as the decision-making center. Meetings can take over a dozen hours to reach a decision, but once one is reached, the emperor meets the liaison members in imperial conference and gives official sanction to whatever they've decided. But these decisions are, in fact, collective consensus. So sure, the government has been much more centralized, and sure, the Army and Navy have mostly been getting their way this year and last, but the power is still pretty fragmented, and military control is far from absolute. Even when Hideki Tojo becomes prime minister, his power is far from absolute, as I discussed in the Tojo Bio special. As we saw in the regular episodes, Konoye's clashes with the military caused him to resign, and Tojo comes to power to continue preparations for war with the US, Britain, and the Netherlands, with the expectation that the ongoing negotiations with Washington will fail. Tojo is also still Army Minister at the same time, and even also Home Minister for a few months. But other than the Naval Minister, most of the rest of the cabinet are civilian bureaucrats. I'm not going to go beyond that in time today, partly because I talked a bit about it in the Tojo bio, but also because I will talk about developments in the Japanese government in future as they happen in the regular weekly episodes. I wanted to do this episode today so you can see that going into a war with the Western powers, Japan is not the national defense state many hardliners have dreamed and schemed for. It is far from a military dictatorship. The emperor does not have the control many think he does, and Japan is instead run by a whole bunch of different competing civilian and military groups and offices, each with its own agenda at home and abroad, each jealously guarding its own sphere of influence, and many of them not only with competing interests, but without oversight. In short, it's a mess. And Tojo, while running a gigantic war, is going to have to try to pull it all together for his nation to function. I do not envy him. If you want to learn more about Japan in the 1930s, then click here for a Between Two Wars episode about that on our Time Ghost channel, any minute now. And join the Time Ghost Army to get more and more specials like this that help explain the world of the World War a bit deeper, or perhaps a bit more confusingly. Do that at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. See you next time.